Hello and welcome to We Are Human, the podcast where we aim to educate, empower and inspire you on the pro-life issue. Coming up in this month's episode, the truly shocking story of a woman who nearly died and how life-saving advice that was previously ignored could have impacted her situation. Ireland is to recommend legalising assisted suicide. I'll give you an update on that. As always, we'll go beyond the headlines and give you your courageous communication tip. But first, it's time for Fantastic Facts. So this month for Fantastic Facts, we're focusing on the baby's development at just 12 weeks old. This is a really big week for baby because the baby's key body systems and vital organs have formed, including those that are going to do things like help fight off germs and make eating food possible. One of the other fascinating things that's happening at this time is that the baby's bone marrow is making white blood cells. So that means they'll be able to fight off all those germs that can be passed around on the playground. And the baby has more than doubled in size during the past 3 weeks. All the organs, the muscles, the limbs, and the bones, they're all in place. And the sex organs are well developed as well. From now on, the baby just has to grow and mature. It's one of those enduring memories for me. My very first baby at the 12-week scan, just seeing that baby bouncing around on the sonogram and hearing the doctor say, hey, your baby's fully formed. They just have to grow. It is truly incredible that at this point, kidneys are functioning, the baby is swallowing amniotic fluid and passing urine. They're doing things like practicing their breathing and their movements and their digestive system. All of that practice is happening too. The baby's actually constantly moving around. So stretching, yawning, they're doing a lot of wriggling, and the heart is beating strongly. It's amazing to hear with a heart monitor. How incredible that this is happening at just 12 weeks. And on the one hand, truly incredible, but on the other, truly heartbreaking that also at this very moment in time where baby is, as I said, fully formed, but just has to grow, just has to develop and mature, that a woman in Ireland can have an abortion up to 12 weeks for any reason whatsoever. So it's up to us when we learn these fantastic facts to make sure that we continue to share the development of the unborn baby so people join the dots about what we know about the baby's development and how truly barbaric abortion is. Now, I wanted to give you an update on Ireland's recommendation to introduce assisted suicide. So the background to this is there was an Oireachtas Healthcare Committee tasked with looking at this issue over the last number of months, the guts of a year really. They've been hearing from so many different people from Ireland and from all over the world, sharing their experience and giving their thoughts on assisted suicide. Much of the contributions were given by medics from Ireland and from other countries. And I have to say, from my perspective, just looking at this even dispassionately, having watched much of the proceedings and having read all of the transcripts, I cannot understand how those sitting on this committee would have recommended to introduce assisted suicide. I'm going to go into more detail in that, but I wanted to start by just showing you two contributions from one of the latest committee hearings just before the committee wrapped up their business, because we have touched on many of the contributions before, but I wanted to just give you an idea of some of the contributions leading up to the final report. Now, the first is from Professor Roderick McLeod. Now, he is from the University of Auckland and he's a specialist physician in hospice and palliative care with decades of experience. Have a listen of some of what he had to say.
1 in 10 older people experience psychological abuse in any given year. By assisting people to end their life, our society would be sending the message that some lives are not worth living. Such a change in attitude could place pressure on vulnerable people, including older people and those living with dementia and those with a disability. The existing and proposed safeguards in legislation in some countries, and New Zealand is a good example of this, to protect people with mental disorders and impaired decision-making capacity, require referral for assessment from a psychiatrist or other specialist. In jurisdictions where this requirement is optional, it is rarely used. Where it is mandatory, significant concerns remain about the assessment of capacity and the presence of mental illness in people with a terminal illness. The sense of hopelessness that accompanies many towards the end of life can be limited, and hope can be restored once its absence is addressed. This requires effective and compassionate communication by clinicians over time to ensure all aspects of hope are addressed. Palliative care in many countries around the world is widely available, but not always understood by the public and the professions alike. Education on palliative care is inadequate in many universities, considering the importance of this aspect of medical care. All doctors will have to care for people near the end of life, particularly in the early years of practice. So adequate and effective education is needed before graduation and subsequently. The effect on health professionals of legalising euthanasia is underestimated by many and sadly rarely discussed. The effects can seriously adversely impact on individuals' ability to continue to practice.
One of the things that really struck me there about Professor McLeod's contribution that was so powerful is that he said, yes, requests for hastened death, they're not uncommon, but they're rarely sustained once effective palliative care is provided. And that is something that was echoed to me by many palliative care doctors that I spoke to as part of my research for this, was that yes, this does happen, but once patients see a clear care pathway, a holistic care pathway, and many of their concerns addressed, they soon do not have that desire anymore. So what that says to me, and the message is very clear, we have to be focusing all our efforts on assisting people to truly die with dignity and not introducing a system that could well take away and undermine the palliative care system that is here in Ireland. One of the other things that struck me about his contribution was the most common factors precipitating these requests, you see, are psychological. You see, it's put out there to us, and it's a real misrepresentation that this is about solving physical pain or physical pain that can't be solved. My understanding from listening to many palliative care doctors at the committee is that this is not the driving force. As Professor McLeod said there, it's psychological in nature, and surely we should be doing everything we can to combat psychological distress. And one of the things is that what's clear, I think, from looking at these committee hearings is that palliative care in a lot of countries around the world, it's widely available, but I don't think it's always understood exactly what it means and how it truly is helping people to die, as we say here in Ireland, a good death. It's not understood by the public, and I think it's not even understood by some members of the healthcare professionals. And one of the other things that wasn't talked about enough, and it was great that Professor McLeod brought it up here, is the effect on health professionals of legalising euthanasia. We have here a situation in Ireland where the medical profession on the whole overwhelmingly is saying, do not bring this into this country, yet this is who it's going to be heaped back on. And he was talking about just the impact on healthcare professions that can seriously and adversely impact their ability to continue to even practice medicine. How can that evidence actually be ignored? It's clear that ideology is trumping logic here. I wanted to bring you another contribution now to the committee, which was Dr. Matthew Dorey from the Association of Palliative Medicine. Now, this is actually the largest representative body of palliative care physicians in Great Britain and Ireland. They are one of the largest in the world because they have a membership of more than 1,300. And once again, this professional body of those who are dealing with death every day, this is their job, are overwhelmingly opposed to any form of assisted suicide or euthanasia. Take a listen to some of his presentation.
Thank you. The Association of Palliative Medicine is the largest representative body of palliative care physicians in Great Britain and Ireland. Indeed, we're one of the largest in the world, with a membership of over 1,300. Thus, we represent those doctors who look after and treat dying the most out of any medical professional. This is our day job. This is worth noting because in consistent surveys and polls, upward of 82% of our membership are against this legislation being enacted. Indeed, in our 2022 poll in Scotland, this was 98% stated that assisted dying should not be part of mainstream healthcare. And it is not just our membership. These numbers have been replicated in the 2020 BMA survey, with 85% of palliative care physicians opposed. Our position statement is thus clear. We oppose legislation legalising assisted dying. Why? Why are palliative medicine against something which is touted as reducing suffering and providing choice, both fundamental to our specialty? Why is arguably the most accepting, forward-thinking, progressive group of doctors against this legislation? This is surely pause for thought on today's topic of protecting palliative care. I think palliative care has an insight that inevitably there will be incorrect deaths with this legislation. What we mean by incorrect deaths is that there'll be people who have assisted dying who have, one, an incorrect diagnosis, such as in Canada, the misdiagnosis of COPD that happened, or dare I mention the spate of MND misdiagnoses up north recently. 2, their prognosis is unpredictable. I believe you're aware how poor we are at prognosticating.
Yeah, one of the things that was frightening from that contribution was this whole idea of incorrect deaths, and that there'll be people who have incorrect diagnosis, and the examples given there in Canada of COPD and different things, or the spate of motor neuron diseases misdiagnosed recently, and also that prognosis is unpredictable. Our legislation here that's being looked at, that's being proposed, is with someone who has less than 6 months to live, or 12 months if it's a neurodegenerative disease. But that, as I'm sure many of you watching and listening know, is something that is unpredictable and can often be wrong. And so often, families are told somebody has a few months and they end up getting a lot more time, precious time, with that loved one. Indeed, I remember back to Alma Walsh's contribution to the committee, the mother of Donal, where she talked about that several times, being told he's a few weeks left and he lived for many months more, and just the impact that he had on his family and his community in that time. One of the things, the takeaway points here is, in every jurisdiction that has legalized assisted dying for longer than 10 years, there's been an extension. So this idea of safeguards is something that I just think Irish politicians can't stand over, and that's based on the evidence from other countries. One other powerful contribution was given by Professor Desmond O'Neill. He's a consultant geriatrician, and he's actually a professor of geriatric medicine. He's the most widely published clinician in ethics, and it was very powerful in his contribution when he said, according to the Danish Council of Ethics, which we often look to Nordic countries, don't we, for guidance on these things, they said in relation to assisted suicide and euthanasia, it can neither be regulated nor limited. Have a little look at some more of his contribution here.
I take my opening quote from the recent policy statement by the Danish Council on Ethics. Arising from a progressive, liberal and pluralist society, the sort of Nordic society to which we often turn for leadership and insight into excellence in care. Based on a broad committee of experts in ethics, care and philosophy, they said, the very existence of an offer of euthanasia will decisively change our ideas about old age, the coming of death, quality of life, and what it means to take others into account. If euthanasia becomes an option, there is too great a risk that it will become an expectation aimed at special groups in society. The whole impetus of medicine is a recognition of our common shared vulnerability, strengths and solidarity in a fabric of mutual support. This is supported by an ethos of hope, competence and supporting our fellow citizens from suffering and despair to the greatest extent possible. A challenge to this solidarity arises from many sources, from emerging neoliberal and capitalist discourses which seek to separate and prioritise the individual over the collective good, to prejudice against disability and ageing, to eugenic impulses which resurface periodically even in modern societies. A particular prejudice is associated with conditions affecting memory, such as dementia, despite increasing knowledge both of quality of life, but also of how best to engage and support those affected. A striking example of how good care can be subverted by a sentimental approach to euthanasia is seen in the movie $1 Million Baby. We are asked to sympathise for the killing of the quadriplegic woman boxer by her coach, but this arises at the end of an extraordinary catalogue of missed therapeutic opportunities. Her pressure sores, an infected leg which led to an amputation, are indicators of substandard care by any standards. She clearly had a severe untreated depression and unresolved family strife, and no effort was made to provide a more domestic and personalised environment in her care facility. The impact of this erosion of the social support framework was most notable in a recent case where a nursing home doctor in the Netherlands failed to recognise the refusal for euthanasia by a person living with dementia arising from a prior advance directive. As doctors, we recognise that people change with the course of their illness, and failing to read these signals, the doctor sedated the patient without her knowledge and consent and had her family physically restrain her while she was euthanized. In terms of tolerance for this major breach of trust and solidarity, what is worrying that the professions and courts in the Netherlands sided with the doctor rather than the person who had been killed. It is this erosion of the wider caring and solidarity contract which is most corrosive in permitting assisted suicide and euthanasia. An oft-heard refrain is that of control in the face of terminal illness, failing to recognise both the advances in recognition of consent for and refusal of treatment, advances in support and care. While autonomy is hugely important, it is exercised in the embrace of others and mediated by other principles such as justice, doing good and not doing harm on not only the person, but also those around them, an impact on the social contract. An equal issue is that of dignity. It is aspects of the care and settings which may be undignified rather than the person. And the collective impulse of medicine over millennia has been to improve knowledge, skills and attitudes of staff and develop more appropriate care settings. The negative impacts of assisted suicide and euthanasia in Canada, Oregon and the Netherlands, in practical terms, an erosion of a positive supportive approach to care, have been eloquently described to this committee by Dr. Harvey Chochinov, among others, echoed by the position paper of the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland, widely circulated among 14,000 specialists, raising concerns on impact of assisted suicide and euthanasia on principles and standards of care, suicide prevention, combating discrimination, and failing to learn from past and present adverse experiences. So to finish, to ask doctors to run counter to this by killing patients short-circuits and undermines our impetus to care, comfort and support, and damages not only the framework of care, but also our shared humanity. Current and future patients need to be reassured that the response of the healthcare professions to distress and pain is one of solidarity, compassion and care, addressing the needs at a range of levels while respecting wishes to the greatest extent possible.
It's pretty chilling hearing from Professor O'Neill there just how counterintuitive it is to doctors asking them to short-circuit what they trained themselves to do, which is to care, to comfort, to support, and how counterintuitive making consensual killing part of the healthcare framework actually is, and how that must affect patients who need to be reassured that their healthcare professionals looking after them are with them with the appropriate care, with compassion. They're with them in solidarity. What difference is it going to make if you have to now tick a box? Do you wish to have assisted dying, yes or no? That's already put out there into the ether. Now, that's just a little bit of a snapshot of some of the contributions that were presented at the Oireachtas Committee hearings on assisted suicide and euthanasia. And just looking at it on the whole is, so many shocking things were learned. For example, assisted suicide and euthanasia account for 1 in 20 deaths in the Netherlands. That is just one of so many disturbing pieces of evidence presented to the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Assisted Dying. And now that same committee has recommended to introduce this into our country. Now, this is just something that will be presented to government. It's by no means legislation yet. And it's up to you to contact your local representatives if you're not happy with that. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we're meant to be assured by the fact that it's going to be restricted to those who have less than 6 to 12 months to live, depending on the illness. Yet even before we have any draft legislation, those pushing for it are largely opposed to time limits. Many of the interviews and indeed those who present at the committee that are in favour of this are certainly more in favour of a subjective approach. In other words, how an individual feels their own suffering, the individual experience of suffering. So promises of safeguards are hollow, and it's something that we can't be naive about. It's unfathomable to me, having read all the transcripts, that this recommendation has been made. And as I mentioned, the very sad irony, that medical professionals working in the area of managing terminal illness, they're the ones who are opposed to it. We're talking about the Royal College of Physicians, the Irish College of Psychiatrists, the Irish Association for Palliative Care Consultants. They're the ones who are saying no. But they're the ones that are going to be asked to carry out this legislation. We're talking about, one of the bodies I mentioned, the Royal College of Physicians, they represent over 15,000 doctors in Ireland. And they're saying, hang on, no. This is going to completely undermine the quality of care and radically alter and negatively alter how we view dying, disability and ageing. The only conclusion we can come to is that our elected representatives have once again decided ideology trumps evidence, societal impacts and logic. And of course, we have to acknowledge the committee also heard truly difficult experience of human suffering. Now, the core argument for these individual cases was that of autonomy, of choice, but choice does not exist in a vacuum. It's not one that affects just the individual, but the whole of society. Now, several contributors working in the area of palliative care talked about how rare it was that, hastening death was that request once the effective palliative care was provided. And here's the thing about Ireland. In the latest cross-country comparison analysis, this was conducted in 2021, Ireland was placed second out of 81 countries for the quality of its end-of-life care. This is something that we are doing well. We need to do better. There's a lot more work to be done. But assisted suicide and euthanasia will totally undermine this. Now, often proponents in rebutting the horror that's been unleashed in countries like Canada and Belgium and the Netherlands, I feel they're kind of clutching at straws. They reference places like Australia and New Zealand, who only legalised the practice in 2023 and 2021. So it's very new for those countries. And countries like Canada show how quickly so-called strict proposals, similar to our own, don't last long. To put it in perspective, the death rate in Canada from assisted suicide and euthanasia since its introduction only 8 years ago has increased by 1,000%. And by 2027, Canada is going to legalise assisted suicide and euthanasia for those with mental health illness. Other evidence that was given by Dr. Leopold van Vallingham from the European Institute of Bioethics, and they've been looking at this issue for 20 years, explained here, this is why it quickly becomes far-reaching. They said from the very beginning, the euthanasia control committees in Canada, Belgium and the Netherlands considered the idea of suffering as subjective. So basically what that means is what the patient says about his or her suffering, that's what should be considered as binding by the doctor, irregardless of whether the patient's pain could actually be relieved, for example, by palliative care. The horror stories presented to the committee, they're too numerous to recount. But some of the examples, just to give you an idea, include the Paralympic Army veteran who asked her local authority for a stair lift, the woman who was awaiting treatment for months for her complex chronic disease, the woman who was denied affordable housing, the cancer patient who wasn't given any timeline for his treatment. Instead of getting the care they were deserved, all were offered MAID or medical assistance in dying. Lengthy waits for treatment is common in places like Canada, while availing of assisted suicide takes just days. In fact, Canadian doctors are now told to propose MAID as an option in certain circumstances. Or what about the 23-year-old Belgian girl who was legally killed as the answer to her depression? Or the woman in the Netherlands with dementia who was forcibly held down while the doctor killed her? Or the deaf Belgian twins who were euthanized after learning they would go blind? The culture changes because it is not the choice to die, but is a duty to die. That's why the evidence consistently shows that one of the core reasons people request assisted dying is because they feel like a burden. It's also very interesting to note that around the world, disability rights organisations are overwhelmingly opposed to assisted suicide and euthanasia. They see the demonstrable impact that it can have on devaluing their lives and also giving the state an excuse to forego their responsibilities. And it provides an almost existential threat to disabled people. One of the other people who presented to the committee was Dr. Siobhan McHale. She represented the College of Psychiatrists of Ireland, and she explained that as psychiatrists, they believe it's not possible to clearly differentiate between suicidal patients and patients who request assisted dying. Now, several contributors highlighted the potential that it has to normalise suicide in Ireland. And it's really sad because we've come so far in trying to prevent it. In fact, the professor of healthcare ethics, Theo Barr, gave evidence, having just returned from a congress with 250 psychiatrists, which were looking at this issue, the issue of the connection between euthanasia and suicide. And he detailed that in the Netherlands, the violent suicide rate increased by 35%. So we're now going to have a situation in Ireland, if this goes through, that on the one hand, the government will support suicide prevention for some vulnerable groups. And on the other hand, there'll be state-sanctioned suicide for other people. We will create two forms of suicide. One which we're saying this is very upsetting and worthy of huge efforts to prevent, and another which is given the protection of law. How can that premise actually make sense. The evidence presented to the committee is a cautionary tale we have to heed. The cruel disregard for human life that ensures that once you introduce the concept, this idea that some lives are not as valuable as others, it's a dangerous one. And really, we should be doing all we can to strive for the best care possible, rather than debating over whether consensual killing should be part of Irish healthcare. The potential harms far outweigh the arguments being made in favour of legislation. Will the committee listen to a small but vocal minority? Or will they reconsider the medical experts, the experience of other countries, and the tragic stories of vulnerable lives being unnecessarily ended? Just remember as well, when politicians come knocking on your door, come local and European election time, it's up to you to tell them this is an issue that matters to you, that this is an issue that's important. That's the only way I think now we'll be able to get through to our elected representatives. Now it's time for this month's Courageous Communication Tip, and it's all about letting go this month. When I mention the pro-life issue, if you see something, let me give you an example. If you see a repeal sticker or a repeal jumper or a Together for Yes sticker on the back of someone's car, how does it make you feel? I'm guessing for some of you watching or listening, it stirs up some negative emotions. Maybe some expletives come to mind, or you're thinking some not so charitable thoughts about the person wearing the jumper or driving the car. It's really good that you recognize these emotions, but it's also important that we learn to let them go. Because having these kind of negative emotions deep-seated within our subconscious and bubbling away in your tummies means that when this issue comes up, when you're discussing it, that's at the back of your mind. And that can colour how you communicate. That can affect how you communicate, because you're not going to communicate in as open-minded a way that would be useful. So it's really important to try and shake them off and to let go of your negative emotions, because really you're trying to communicate positively. The situation now here in Ireland is about rebuilding a culture of life. And it's very hard to do that if before a conversation even gets started, you have negative emotions in your head associated with the topic. So it's a good exercise to put yourself through to process those emotions. Of course, it's important to feel them, but to be aware that when you're having a conversation on the pro-life issue, that you're trying to let go of those emotions, let go of that kind of negative impact that it might have on your communication, so your communication can be a positive one rather than a negative one. Because if it's a positive interaction, it's much more likely that you're going to hear one another, and that the person that you're conversing with might actually be more open to what you have to say. That's this month's Courageous Communication Tip. And now it's time to go beyond the headlines. So this is the part of the podcast where we bring you stories that are often underreported or not reported at all. And the first one that I'm going to focus on today, it's one of those stories that is just so frustrating that the media does not pay more attention to these stories, especially when it concerns the health and safety, and in this particular case, of women's lives. And this is about a shocking new revelation that the then Minister for Health, he's now going to be the next leader of our country, our next Taoiseach, Simon Harris's decision to reject mandatory ultrasounds when it came to abortion has actually put women's lives at risk. Now, the reason that we know this is that there was a paper published in the Irish Medical Journal on the 21st of March 2024, and what it revealed was that a woman almost died from an ectopic pregnancy. Now, this was 3 days after having a medical abortion in Limerick. Now, because there was no ultrasound allowed, where the woman in question, she was just 24 years old, where she had her medical termination, and because the ectopic pregnancy was undetected, 3 days later she was treated in hospital. This could have been life-threatening. And here's the thing, this may have happened many times before, we don't know. The only reason we know about this particular story is because it was published in a medical journal. This wasn't some journalist kind of going after this story. In fact, it received very, very little coverage here. Politicians burying their head in the stands, even though this is a really shocking story, and it's just showing the disastrous impact on the decision of the government by 2018. and as I said, the then Minister for Health, Simon Harris, to reject this amendment. So this was an amendment that was put forward that would have mandated an ultrasound before an abortion would have been carried out. It was tabled in 2018. It meant that this particular issue, in terms of a doctor being able to detect an ectopic pregnancy, would have been caught before the woman had an abortion and would have avoided such dangerous and life-threatening outcomes. And the World Health Organization says that medical abortion can make undiagnosed ectopic pregnancy particularly difficult to identify, because you see the symptoms of a ruptured ectopic pregnancy and a medical abortion can actually be so similar, and that's what makes it especially dangerous. And it's hard to understand how those who, tout choice and tout looking after women, that when you have something black and white here that shows you the negative impact that not having these sonograms and these ultrasounds can have on the potential of a woman's life being at risk, that it's just ignored, because anything that does anything to challenge the abortion narrative is just ignored. In fact, pretty much every amendment that was tabled in 2018 was dismissed, most of them so humane. And, this amendment was rejected. It's laughable, really. And what a spurious ground. It's about choice. What about the health of the woman? And it's now we're seeing the consequence of this reckless decision, which basically leaves women at risk of unidentified ectopic pregnancy. And it can rupture. It can result in life-threatening internal hemorrhages. Now, it's been further exacerbated, this particular problem, because of the ongoing use of telemedical abortion, which was in early 2020 that this was brought in. It was during the COVID pandemic, even though Simon Harris at the time said, absolutely, Ireland is not going to have telemedical abortion. And it removed the requirement then with this that a woman would even meet their GP before receiving the abortion pill. So that even precludes the possibility of an examination, let alone an ultrasound. And this alarming case in Limerick happened under the current telemedical regime. So the government really, if they care about women and looking after them, need to end telemedicine abortion and make the provision for the widespread use of the ultrasound before the termination of a pregnancy. Take a look at this special report which explains this particular case further.
It emerged that a woman from Limerick almost died from an ectopic pregnancy 3 days after undergoing an abortion. Back in 2018, before the abortion bill passed into law, Simon Harris scoffed at TDs who called for ultrasound provision to be made widely available.
But we just want to make the point that the importance of ultrasounds for determining the gestational age of the unborn child and for protecting the life or health of the woman who is undergoing an abortion cannot be overstated, particularly in circumstances where there are concerns about the dating in a pregnancy. And, there was much discussion on that element through the committee and all the rest of it. So it seems very reasonable, that we would have this amendment provided for. But it also would, relate to where there is an ectopic pregnancy, as has been pointed out.
And to subject every woman to that ultrasound. That's what it does. It would be a terrible use of what people rightly point out is a scarce resource.
The research just published in the official journal of the Irish Medical Organisation on the woman who nearly died in Limerick clearly states that this outcome could have been prevented had an ultrasound been used to detect the location of the pregnancy. One of the excuses given by abortion campaigners back in 2018 for not backing the widespread availability of ultrasound was that it would take away choice from women. All health and safety concerns were ignored. The very thing that TDs like Carol Nolan warned would happen has now come to pass. The government needs to put ideology to one side and put women and their unborn babies center stage by immediately expanding provision of ultrasound facilities across the country.
I wanted to bring you a different angle on another story. I'm sure many of you saw lovely videos as part of World Down Syndrome Day on the 24th of February just gone. And one of the themes for the day was end the stereotypes. But the hypocrisy is staggering. On the one hand, you have politicians and NGOs and all that sort of stuff, people sharing these videos. And on the other hand, we have those very same people, part of a culture that means that in countries where abortion is available, like in Ireland, the vast majority of people with Down syndrome have their lives ended before they are even born. But still, let's take a little look at one of the videos that was launched for World Down Syndrome Day.
Hey bartender, you assume that I cannot drink a margarita, so you don't serve me a margarita? So I don't drink a margarita. Your assumption becomes reality. And parents, you assume that I cannot live on my own, so you don't encourage me to live on my own, so I don't live on my own. Coach, you assume that I cannot hit harder, so you don't train me to hit harder, so I don't hit harder. And teacher, you assume that I cannot learn Shakespeare, so you don't teach me Shakespeare.
Old MacDonald had a farm,
so I don't learn Shakespeare. E-I-E-I-O. But hey, if all your assumptions become reality, then assume that I can drink a margarita. So you serve me a margarita, so I drink a margarita. Assume that I can live on my own, so I live on my own. Assume that I can hit harder, so I hit harder. Assume that I can learn Shakespeare. So, what fools these mortals be? I learned Shakespeare. You assume I can't swear, right? Assume that I can do that job, that I can go to parties, that I can have sex, that I can be on stage. Assume that I can. So maybe I will.
I absolutely love that video, but I couldn't help but think when I was watching it, obviously the theme is about making assumptions. What about assuming that they don't have the right to be born? Interestingly, Pope Francis' envoy to the United Nations highlighted just talking about people with Down syndrome and their families and their society, but lambasted the eugenic mentality of countries who use abortion, who are really eliminating people with Down syndrome. So on the one hand, we're saying, yay, World Down Syndrome Day. And on the other hand, there's countries that are actively eradicating these people. You know, in some countries, nearly 100% of parents who receive a prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome are choosing to end the life of their son or daughter. So we have to end the hypocrisy where we're offering this unprecedented social inclusion on the one hand, which is great, but on the other hand, we're destroying their lives. We're not even letting the chance to be born. We are literally wiping them out. And I think we have to expose this hypocrisy and the barbarism. Remember, in some countries, abortion is available for children who have been diagnosed with Down syndrome up until birth. And there's been so many stories reported over the years, in the UK in particular, I can recall several, where the pressure that was put on women at each antenatal appointment, are you sure you don't want an abortion? Are you sure you don't want to kill this baby? It just shows you the level of disability discrimination and the pressure and the eugenic mentality that sets in when abortion is allowed. I have to say, I found this next story pretty stomach churning, and it's about Olivia Rodrigo. She's a very popular young girl. She's a singer. She'd be really popular worryingly with teens and tweens. And I say worryingly when you hear this next story, because I mean, she has an incredible platform, doesn't she, to be an amazing role model to young women. But yet she's chosen her platform to actually endanger women and just their health. And I think even just their kind of understanding of the world, because she gave out Plan B, it's called Plan B medication, basically the morning after pill, at one of her concerts. She partnered with the Missouri Abortion Fund, and she announced that part of the money from her concert would be used to fund abortion. Wow, what a disservice to her fans who might not want to have any hand, act, or part in abortion. And by going to her concert, now they realise they have. Have a little look at this video of her where she's talking about the fund.
A portion of all of the proceeds from the ticket sales of the Guts World Tour will go to the Fund for Good, which I'm very excited about. And for the North American leg of the Guts World Tour, I'll be partnering with the National Network of Abortion Funds to help those impacted by healthcare barriers in getting the reproductive care they deserve. To learn more about reproductive health resources and how you can help, visit abortionfunds.org, or you can stop by the National Network of Abortion Funds table at your local Guts World Tour stop. So thank you so much for supporting this cause that I care so deeply about, and I can't wait to see you all on tour. Thanks again. Mwah.
Yeah, as usual, when it comes to abortion propaganda, that video is full of euphemisms, you know, the reproductive health care they deserve. I mean, what does that even mean? Imagine a star like Olivia Rodrigo advocating for authentic choice, for truly tackling the root causes that drive women towards feeling like they have no choice in the first place. And, you know, of all the causes in the world right now for her to be partnering with, it beggars belief that this would be one of them. And handing out the Plan B pills at her concert, what sort of a message is that sending? Well, to me, it's clear. Hey, go have unprotected sex. It's no consequence. Just take these pills. That's how meaningless life is. That's how little your body means. I'm to be honest, I'm pretty surprised that there hasn't been more made of this, even for parents, whatever they feel on the abortion issue, that this kind of carry on would be happening at one of her concerts, that a powerful role model is sending all the wrong messages to these young girls. That's all we've got time for on this month's Beyond the Headlines. And that's all we've got time for on the We Are Human podcast. I've been your host, Wendy Grace, and this podcast is brought to you by the Pro-Life Campaign in Ireland. Do make sure that you like, share and subscribe on your favourite platform. I'll talk to you next month.